Good evening, everybody. I'm Quentin Kopp. For those who have not met me in this form or in the flesh before, I'm chair of the Society, and for those of you who've read Homage to Catalonia, I'm George Kopp's son. This evening's talk is being given by Peter, who I am assured really upset Sonia by bringing out his book about Orwell with his colleague Abrams, and I'm sure will stimulate you all tonight. I look forward to hearing from you, Peter, as I'm sure everybody else does. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. And I'm delighted to see that Diane Venables is here, because I remember with great pleasure having delightful meetings with her in London, I guess in the planning stages for the Orwell Society, which has been with us thanks largely to her since 2011. So I'm flattered and honored to be asked to give you a short talk. I'm working on a very short book about George Orwell and war, not Evelyn, but W-A-R. And of course there's been a lot of attention to that, and I hope, but I'm not sure, that I might be able to say something new about it. And the years leading up to the First World War and the First World War and its importance for Orwell, I don't think has received quite all the attention it deserves. There's obviously been a lot of attention to the Spanish Civil War and the importance of that for him. There's been some attention to the Second World War and some attention to the Cold War. And those seem to me the wars, and that one always has continually to remind oneself that in fact in the Oxford Dictionary, OED, Orwell is given credit to being the coiner, or one of the first users in a review he wrote, of the term Cold War. In any case, what I wish to do my morning, I'm in California, so it's now 11, but your evening, those of you who are in England or Britain, to talk in a little detail about an aspect of a rather formal talk about one of the aspects of Orwell's being influenced by wartime, and specifically about the pamphlet he wrote, The Lion and the Unicorn. So, bear with me. His most important publication during the war, the Second World War, was The Lion and the Unicorn. He had established cordial relations with Frederick Warburg, the publisher of Homage to Catalonia. In fact, Warburg was his corporal in his Home Guard unit. Through Warburg, he met Tosco Fievel. It was Fievel's original idea, I believe, that something should be written about war aims. Warburg had published Fievel's book, No Ease in Zion, and Fievel brought his publishing idea to him. Orwell, Fievel, Warburg, and the German refugee Sebastian Haffner met in Warburg's London flat, as well as in the garden of his country cottage in Twyford, Berkshire, to discuss this possibility, while air battles of the Battle of Britain took place over their heads. It's a nice touch, I think, that considering Orwell's rather ambivalent attitude towards Jews, that Fievel and Warburg were Jewish, and that Haffner, though not Jewish, was a refugee from Germany. They decided to launch a series of very short books, or perhaps more accurately long pamphlets, searchlight books, to be edited by Fievel and Orwell. The tracts were to discuss desirable changes in Britain that should come about because Britain was at war, but eventually they ventured into other areas. It was announced rather grandly that, quote, "It is the aim of Searchlight Books to do all in their power to criticize and kill what is rotten in Western civilization and supply constructive ideas for the difficult period ahead of us. The series will stress Britain's international and imperial responsibilities and the aim of a planned Britain at the head of a greater and freer British Commonwealth. End of quote. Orwell's The Lion and the Unicorn was the first published. Orwell and Fievel were deeply involved with the series during most of its brief existence. It flourished in 1941 as Orwell could devote more time to it before being employed by the BBC. It was later curtailed by Warburg's press experiencing a shortage of paper, largely caused by the Blitz hitting its supplies. And it was rather dramatic that the future of Britain was being discussed during the worst days of the London Blitz. The books began very successfully with Orwell's own work. It sold very well, over 10,000 copies. He was then becoming better known, as indicated by Penguin reissuing his Down and Out in Paris and London in an edition of 55,000 in December 1940. The short Searchlight books were priced at a modest 2 shillings. Ultimately, 10 titles appeared. Among the most interesting was Richie Calder's The Lesson of London, where he pointed out that the experiences of the Blitz in London made it evident how essential and necessary it was for the government to take a much more active role in the welfare of all its citizens. T.C. Worsley, in The End of the Old School Tie, argued that the public schools would have to be much reformed and incorporated into a truly public system in the post-war world. As Orwell wrote in his foreword to that book, the Searchlight books have been planned to deal with the immediate rather than the distant future. Certain problems, however, are bound to arise in an urgent form as soon as the war is over, and are likely to be dealt with in some shoddy makeshift way unless they're thought out in detail beforehand. The most successful in the series was The English at War by Cassandra, William Connor, the very popular columnist in the Daily Mirror. In it, he very briefly told amusing stories about how the English were coping and railed against the powers that be. It sold more than 30,000 copies. The books were not exclusively domestic. Arturo Barria wrote Struggle for the Spanish Soul about the Spanish Civil War, in which he had played an active role on the Republic side. Orwell admired his first volume of autobiography, reviewing it both in Time and Tide and Horizon. Its Horizon's editor, Orwell's old friend Cyril Connolly, was scheduled to write for the series Artist and the New World, but characteristically never did so. Sebastian Haffner, one of the original planners of the series, wrote Offensive Against Germany, dealing with how to wage the propaganda war. Orwell admired the novels by Joyce Carey and commissioned him to write about the future of Britain and Africa, the case for African freedom. The last text to be published in 1942 was Life and the Poet by Stephen Spender. It officially was number 18, but 8 titles that had been announced never appeared, including one by Arthur Kessler and another by G.E. Catlin, Vera Brittain's husband, about whether Britain and the United States should unite. I should like to look at The Lion and the Unicorn with its somewhat, I think, contradictory subtitle, Socialism and the English Genius, in a little more detail. It is, I think, a very important Orwell text in marking his commitment to democratic socialism. Published in February 1941, at the height of the Blitz, it makes very clear how important the advent of the war was in shaping Orwell's ideas. He committed himself in this work even more deeply to being both an intense patriot and socialist. As he wrote in Tribune on December 20, 1940, we are in a strange period of history in which a revolutionary has to be a patriot, and a patriot has to be a revolutionary. He was rather sweeping in his views, I think. He wrote in the Left News in January 1941, "We cannot beat Hitler without passing through revolution, nor consolidate our revolution without beating Hitler. A victory over Hitler demands the destruction of capitalism," or as you might say, capitalism. "Either we turn this war into a revolutionary war, excuse me, or we lose it." The lion and the unicorn, as you all know, are the heraldic beasts that support the royal coat of arms. The text both celebrates I think both a very traditional England, with its many rather sweeping generalizations about its nature as found in various aspects, in his view generally gentle, of English life. At the same time, it marked more vividly than he had ever written before his admiration and commitment to the English working class, which would play a major role in his belief that the hope for salvation in 1984 might be found in the proles. He tended to romanticize, I think, perhaps legitimately, their virtues, their dislike of pretension, their lifestyle, their empiricism, their belief in the fairness of the law, and to his mind that supreme virtue, their commitment to human decency. These might well be factors that could humanize socialism. He did not neglect the middle class, and that it might produce a new sort of intelligentsia, not the more theoretical that could lead to totalitarian thinking, but again in the English empirical tradition that could help achieve a democratic socialist society. These hopes are combined with powerful assertions of the imperative need for radical changes, suggested by the subtitle, which in Orwell's view will make it possible to keep the positive aspects of English life. Yet he recognized the ability of English institutions to preserve so much of themselves. As he began the review of a book about Eton in 1948, it is hard to disentangle admiration from dismay when one learns that Eton in 1948 is almost exactly as it was in 1918. It is, I believe, in the long tradition of how some reform often takes place and is thought about in England. I've often cited elsewhere the peroration of Thomas Babington Macaulay's speech in Parliament in March 1831 in support of the much debated and controversial Great Reform Act passed in 1832. It was such a significant step in moving England slowly, though in so many ways, forward towards creating a more democratic society. The 1832 Act, expanded the franchise to include the male middle class, establishing, perhaps reluctantly and claiming otherwise, the precedent that the franchise might be further broadened, as it was in the following years. Macaulay's phrase might be taken for representing much of what Orwell believed, I think, about his beloved England. Reform so you may preserve. As Macaulay went on to conclude, renew the youth of the state, save the multitude, endangered by their own ungovernable passions, save the aristocracy, endangered by its own unpopular power, save the greatest and the fairest and most highly civilized community that ever existed. In The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell made explicit the connection between what he had experienced during the First World War and what he was feeling at the time of the Second. His attitude earlier towards the First World War was mostly dismissive, yet it had added to some extent to the foundations of patriotism formed before the war itself. Orwell's take on the Second World War dramatically revived and strengthened his patriotism. As he wrote in the essay, short essay, My Country, Right or Left, a few months before, quote, "You felt yourself a little less of a man because you had missed the First World War. Patriotism has nothing to do with conservatism. It is devotion to something that is changing, but is felt to be mystically the same." Orwell's view of patriotism, the influence upon him, and its relevance for the Second World War were vastly expanded in this short book of 64 pages. He felt very strongly that the war presented both the opportunity and the necessity for radical change while keeping loyal to the basic and ancient values of his country. He wrote a series of wonderful generalizations about the many subdued virtues of the English, particularly to be found, he thought, in the working class. He emphasized their dislike of war and the military. While he was writing to it, Eileen wrote to a close friend in December 1940 that the book was, quote, "explaining how to be a socialist, though Tory." This was an amused exaggeration, but it does sum up, as did his sister Avril, by calling him a Tory anarchist, the paradoxes, perhaps even the contradictions, of Orwell's thoughts. Because of the necessity to win the war, Orwell felt that profound changes were necessary. On April 11, 1940, he had written to Humphrey House, "I think it is vitally necessary to do something towards equalizing income, abolishing privilege, and setting free the subject people. Not to put it on any wider ground, I don't believe the war can be otherwise won." End of quote. Orwell predicted, inaccurately, that rather extreme measures might well be necessary during the war to bring about this new, more egalitarian society. Although it was undoubtedly true that the state did become more powerful in organizing for war purposes, but not necessarily in socialist directions. But Orwell believed that socialism was necessary immediately if Britain was to win the war. State ownership of the means of production and the elimination of all class privileges. He felt that the upper classes were misbehaving and asserting themselves despite there being a war on, that there were deep inequalities. Quote, "It is only by revolution that the native genius of the English people can be free. Whether it happens with or without bloodshed is largely an accident of time and place. Patriotism, against which the socialists have fought so long, has become a tremendous lever in their hands." The war led him to believe in the absolute necessity of the establishment of socialism in England. He turned out actually to be wrong. England did establish a war economy, and there was a growing but far from total equality of sacrifice from all classes. But the much more radical transformation that Orwell called for turned out not to be necessary in order to eventually win the war, particularly after the Soviet Union and the United States had entered it. Although the pamphlet is full of Orwell's disdain, both for the intelligentsia of the left and for a Labour Party, in his view, too committed to trade union interests, under the impact of the war, there was a significant shift in his thinking in an even more radical socialist direction. Not in a way anticipated, one might say. His analysis was correct. What he felt needed to happen did not take place during the war itself. Yet the Beveridge Report of 1942 promised, and ultimately later delivered, I believe, not a socialist society, but a welfare state. perhaps in the English way, something of a halfway house. After the war, there was a considerable degree of nationalization of the means of production, as well as the National Health Service and other changes in society. But it was without the power grab by the leaders of the change, which Orwell saw as the destroyer of a good society in Spain, Animal Farm, and Oceania. Excuse me. The first section of the book is England, Your England, where he indulges in a series of rather sweeping generalizations. It begins dramatically, as I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead, trying to kill me. He does not feel any animosity towards them. They are doing their duty, in his view, as patriotic Germans. He regards the power of patriotism as stronger than Christianity or socialism. And turning to England, he argues that it is different from any other country. He believes firmly in national differences. He provides a list of English characteristics and their continuity over the years. Lorries, clogs, old maids, queues, gloomy Sundays, red pillar boxes, love of flowers. Its future will be determined by what it was in the past. He does believe in some of the standard cliches about the English that might be quite unfair. They are not artistic, musical, or intellectual. He does soundly support the received position of English life, whether actually correct or not, that is profoundly gentle and possesses a hatred of war and militarism. Many who lived in the British Empire might not agree with that assessment. But in Orwell's view, the English working class hardly knows that the empire exists and doesn't care very much about it. It is true that other countries might not celebrate what were defeats, ranging from Tennyson's poem The Charge of the Light Brigade many years earlier, to the massive disaster, but also somehow triumph of the Dunkirk evacuation that had taken place some months before. Orwell was writing. As he points out, the most remembered battle names of the First World War mark English disasters. He also believes that the English have great respect for the law, even if they believe it might be excessively severe. He also believed, as I've said, that the English were profoundly patriotic, with its underside of being anti-foreign. Despite perhaps less artistic talents in many fields, the English do excel in the one art that cannot cross borders in its original form, literature. And in these pages there emerges his famous definition of England, quote, "England is the most class-ridden country under the sun. But in any calculation about it, one has got to take into account its emotional unity. It's the tendency of nearly all its inhabitants to feel alike and act together in moments of extreme crisis. England is not the jeweled island of Shakespeare's much-quoted passage, nor is it the inferno depicted by Dr. Goebbels. More than either, it resembles a family, a rather stuffy Victorian family, with not many black sheep in it, but with all its cupboards bursting with skeletons. It has rich relations who have to be kowtowed to, and poor relations who are horribly sat upon. And there is a deep conspiracy of silence upon the source of the family income. It is a family in which the young are generally thwarted, and most of the power is in the hands of irresponsible uncles and bedridden aunts. Still, it is a family. It has its private language and its common memories, and in the approach of an enemy, it closes its ranks. A family with the wrong members in control. That, perhaps, is as near as one can come to describing England in a phrase. In many ways, Orwell is in a strong English tradition of radicalism, going back to the Chartists in the first half of the 19th century or even earlier. It is represented by a strong belief in the common people, the working class, their innate decency, virtues that Orwell held in high esteem, and in which he contrasted to their disadvantage to the values held, as radical as they might be, by middle-class intellectuals. He valued the English disdain for theory and its emphasis upon empiricism. It was the strain of English radicalism that so distressed Marx and justified the belief, probably accurate, that English radicalism owed more to Methodism than to Marxism. So in that sense, Orwell, as demonstrated in The Lion and the Unicorn, was very much in an English tradition of radical thought. The members of the family he felt were doing the most harm were the blimps, because of their lack of intelligence, and at the other end of the spectrum, the intelligentsia, for their lack of patriotism. They take their cookery from Paris and their opinions from Moscow. There's a quote. The Bloomsbury highbrow, with its mechanical snigger, is as out of date as the cavalry colonel. Patriotism and intelligence will have to come together again. It is the fact that we are fighting a war, and a very peculiar kind of war, that will make this possible. End of quote. He felt that in the years between the wars, many of the older class distinctions had been breaking down. Though there were still considerable disparities of income, more and more of the population were enjoying a middle-class style of life. The war itself would eliminate he thought, most of the existing class privileges. This led to one of the most lyrical and well-known passages in the work. It contained two sets of rather contradictory predictions of what England would be like after the war. Certainly the changes that he posited did not happen, except presumably for the general use of the tractor. Yet the welfare state did take some steps, or quite a few steps, in the directions he suggested. Quote, the gentleness, the hypocrisy, the thoughtlessness, the reverence for law, and the hatred for uniforms will remain, along with the suet puddings and the misty skies. The stock exchange will be pulled down. The horse-plow will give way to the tractor. The country houses will be turned into children's holiday camps. The Eton and Harrow match will be forgotten. But England will still be England, an everlasting animal, stretching into the future and into the past, and like all living things, having the power to change out of recognition and yet remain the same. End of quote. It was as if he were a disciple of both Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke. This concluded the first section of the work, England, Your England. That part had been published separately in Horizon in December 1940. Excuse me. In the second section, Shopkeepers at War, he continued his political and economic analysis, writing while the Blitz was going on. He felt that the war clearly demonstrated that capitalism did not work. He felt, as he'd been stating for some time, that there needed to be a planned economy in order to win the war. It should include common ownership of the means of production, equality of income, and the abolition of all hereditary privilege. Capitalism in England had failed to prepare for war because, according to Orwell, there had been little profit in armaments. Now, in order to win the war, vast changes was necessary. Quote, it is only by revolution that the native genius of the English people can be set free. Revolution does not mean red flags and street fighting. It means a fundamental shift of power. Whether it happens with or without bloodshed is largely an accident of time and place. What is wanted is a conscious open revolt by ordinary people against inefficiency, class privileges, and the rule of the old. In the short run, equality of sacrifice. It is very necessary that industry be nationalized. but is more urgently necessary that such monstrosities as butlers and private incomes should disappear forthwith." End of quote. It is striking that, like a true Englishman, Orwell thought, I think, in traditional class terms. The third section is the English Revolution. As he wrote yet again, "The war and the revolution are inseparable." Quote, end of quote. It was almost as if he would make it come about by repeating this mantra. He did turn out to be wrong, although to a degree the post-war welfare state had important elements of a social revolution. It is striking that during the war Orwell was both, I think, at his most revolutionary and his most patriotic. He argued here the need for a socialist party that had now the mass of the people behind it. This transformation to a socialist society had to happen as soon as possible in order to win the war. But he was not actually specific on why it was so necessary, but beyond the assertion that it is so. And it was and it certainly did not turn out to be true that the English people needed the promise of a socialist society in order to support the war. The Beveridge Plan, full employment in a free society, was issued in 1942. Though very important, it was of very little interest to Churchill, the Prime Minister, and there's little indication that because of it, the British working class committed itself for fighting for the British state. Probably most were patriotic, undoubtedly, but many might have been socialist, and many might have been socialist. But there's no indication that, contrary to Orwell, the two were necessarily connected. And there is little evidence, contrary to what he saw as a necessity, of pressure from the working class to make immediate steps to make Britain more socialistic. But it is true, as I argued in my book, The First Day of the London Blitz, that faced with the plight of those who were bombed out in London and elsewhere, that the state increasingly recognizes its obligation to keep all its citizens, no matter what their status might be, whether or not they might be members of the deserving or the undeserving poor, or indeed of higher class status. On the other hand, in terms of Orwell's thought, it is significant that the war had convinced him of the connection between war and social action, that war was indeed the possible precipitator of important social change. The Labour Party was not yet a satisfactory vehicle for this change, as its main concerns, he thought, were driven by the unions, that he believed had supported capitalism and the empire, as they were essential for the prosperity that was essential if the workers were to be better paid. Now the war presented a golden and necessary opportunity he thought, for the triumph of genuine socialism. Quote, "A socialist movement that can swing the mass of the people behind it, drive the pro-fascists out of positions of control, wipe out the grosser injustices, and let the working class see that they have something to fight for, to win over the middle classes instead of antagonizing them, produce a workable imperial policy instead of a mixture of humbug and utopianism, bring patriotism and intelligence into partnership. For the first time, a movement of such a kind becomes possible. War is the greatest of all agents of change." End of quote. He appreciated that there might well be violent opposition to the transformation of society, and that he believed that there needed to be a nationalization of land, banks, mines, and other major industries, limitation of income, as well as dominion status for India. This would create a socialist democracy. He did recognize that much educational reform could not take place until after the war, although he felt that both the public schools and the universities should be filled with scholarship students chosen strictly on the basis of ability. He felt that the public schools were little more than places that supported snobbery, and that most of the private elementary schools should be eliminated. Of course, they were where he was educated himself. He did not mention that such had been his own schooling. He did recognize that all of what he wished could be carried out. He did recognize that not all of what he wished could be carried out immediately, but he thought it was essential that the directions be indicated. He also felt that the present government, led by Churchill, needed to be replaced in a general election. The House of Lords will go, but probably not but not the monarchy. The Church of England would be disestablished. What he does not discuss how this will come about. The necessity of the state to use its power to achieve the changes. The love of power as the destructive element in preserving a social society would become a dominant theme in Animal Farm in 1984. He reiterated, his commitment to patriotism. Quote, "Patriotism has nothing to do with conservatism. It is actually the opposite of conservatism, since it is devotion to something that is always changing and yet is felt to be mystically the same. It is the bridge between the future and the past." He recognized that, end of quote. He recognized that patriotism was not totally an attractive concept. As he wrote sometime later in an essay on H.G. Wells, published in Horizon in July, quote, "What has kept England on its feet during the past year? In part, no doubt, some vague idea about a better future, but chiefly the atavistic emotion of patriotism, the ingrained feeling of the English-speaking peoples that they are superior to foreigners." End of quote. Through revolution, believed England would actually become more herself. The Lion and the Unicorn, its message summed up in its title and subtitle, Socialism and the English Genius, was a powerful polemical piece of writing. But perhaps it is not surprising that Orwell didn't want it reprinted. So much of what he hoped for, so much that he thought was necessary, didn't happen. Perhaps to a degree it did, but certainly far less than he wanted and predicted. There was, as I've said, there was the establishment of the welfare state after the war, most notably marked by the introduction of the National Health Service. Many industries were nationalized, though eventually quite a few will return to private ownership. To a greater degree, education at the secondary and tertiary levels was increasingly based on merit. But the public schools, I think, are practically as strong as ever. India and Pakistan became independent nations. The empire disintegrated. The House of Lords was not abolished, but it became dominated by life of peers. The Anglican Church was not disestablished. It was not necessary, as he thought, that socialism be established as soon as possible for Britain to win the war. Yet the sort of country that he envisioned did to some considerable degree come about, at the same time remaining loyal, I think, to Macaulay's dictum that one should reform in order to preserve. I'm sure that Orwell would have a lot to complain about in contemporary England. Yet in so many ways it is a society that has both profoundly changed and yet preserves much of its past. The demands of war motivated Orwell to argue for the necessity of such changes, not only for their own sake, but also he believed they needed to happen in order to win the war. But he was never, as far as I can tell, all that specific how such changes, or even the promise of them, would inspire greater efforts to win the war. Did the beverage plan inspire the public? It might have been a minor factor, but I don't think a major one. although not achieved to the degree that he might have wished, change did ultimately take place after the war, and the war was probably a necessary precondition. War played a crucial role in shaping his thinking about what changes were necessary, not only to win the war, but to make England a more egalitarian and socialist society. As he wrote in Left News on April 1, 1941, what socialists nearly all schools believe is that the destiny and therefore the true happiness of man lies in a society of true communism. That is to say, a society in which all human beings are more or less equal, in which no one has the power to oppress another, in which economic power has ceased to operate, in which men are governed by love and curiosity and not by greed and fear. In many ways, our current societies are full of inequities and abuses of power, but also, perhaps to some degree, closer to Orwell's ideals than at the time when he wrote The Lion and the Unicorn, that is, the English state, which he hoped would be merged with socialism and the English genius. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was very stimulating, very interesting, and sadly, some of his prophecies have not come true. Not least the inequalities. Who would like to ask the first question? I'm getting this slightly out of order. Can you all unmute yourselves first before the questions? And thank Peter for his talk.